Okay, I think I kind of do want to hone in a bit more on this end of theory. So I'm going to read a bit of an excerpt just along this conversation here. So in page 40 in Data and Society, you and your co-author, you write when you say perhaps the most prominent is the idea that research and discovery can now be fully data-driven, with novel insights arising from the computational analysis of large data sets without the need for preconceived hypotheses or theoretical inputs. This is sometimes referred to as the end of theory claim. And then you say, the previous chapter, you say, as discussed in chapter two, hypotheses, categories, and theoretical inputs are already part of how we produce data. So, what I want to kind of touch on is, you both were discussing this notion between quantitative and qualitative, but when I read this in page 40, immediately my head went to this excellent paper I read by, I know you know of him, Mel Andrews, who wrote this paper called the Machine Learning and the Theory-Free Ideal. So it's this idea that you could sort of automate the whole scientific process where kind of like AI agents kind of can do the science for us through the sheer power and potence of big data. And then this, what I just read out, is on this topic of big data. So I'll probably ask this more of a speculative question. Why do you think, Sabina, and then of course please comment on this, Vlasta, that we have this ideology, I would say an ideology, that big data is like the answer to human bias, to the problem of like theory, to the problem of having, like a observer or a subject in the process of science. How do you think this ideology has risen that now, you need like philosophers of data kind of like debunk that claim or refute it? Because it's certainly, as you both have discussed, is certainly not true.
Thank you very much. That's, of course, a very nice question. And I'm writing a book on this, exactly on this question. And why is it that people have this kind of strong belief in data and having this particular epistemic function? And I think ultimately it comes down maybe to two big historical trends that have been intersecting in the history, certainly of Western science and kind of the Anglo-American world, but of course, having been very, very influential pretty much everywhere on the globe. One is the idea of, if you want, glorified idea of induction. So the idea that we really want to have, this kind of um, rock on which we can stand. It's a very human feeling. It's something that we're all very familiar with, like this kind of constant striving for certainty, for something to hold on to in the very confusing thing that is human biological life with its feelings and its very high cognitive capacities and the need to constantly take decisions in an increasingly complex world with an increasingly complex set of tools they need to master. So, of course, this sense of wanting to try and understand the world and have some sort of fixed point of reference in doing that, something that one can really hold on to, one can consider to be reliable and secure. This is something very deep in the human cognitive system. And we're not the only animals, of course, that would go after this kind of certainty, right? And so that impulse, I think, is very much at the basis of thinking about data as something that we can just keep accumulating. We can, spot more and more of these things that we can hold on to, and this will give us some key to unlock decisions we need to take, basically almost to take some responsibility off our shoulders, right? Because the more we can say, listen, this is just the way these things are, these are just the facts, then it becomes much easier to say, well, these are just the facts, and so I will need to do this, or I will need to think in this way, or I will need to go and operate in this particular manner. I will do this job and I will raise my children this particular way. I will vote in a certain way. I mean, we're all looking for something to hold on to when taking all these very, very important life decisions. And I think that's very much the role that historically got ascribed to data more and more. And certainly within the last 20, 30 years, it has become very prominent in public discourse. So I think there is this kind of more human, psychological, social drive behind trying to think about data as the thing to hold on to. And this, I think, has been hugely accelerated and amplified by capitalism. So by the fact that we, since at the very least a couple of hundred years, but the roots of this go much, much deeper into the scientific revolution, I would say, and earlier, there is this sense also through the age of discovery that the accumulation of goods will provide happiness, right? And the accumulation of goods to the point of reaching a surplus, to the point of actually being able to have more than what you potentially need and keep looking for that growth is the way to seek happiness, is the way to maintain a healthy economy, is the way to maintain a healthy society, a healthy planet even. I mean, that idea as a company does now for a few hundred years has become more and more powerful, has become absolutely enshrined in every single system of production, political system, economic system we have working on Earth. I mean, even the ones that are not quite sympathetic need to work with global capitalism. And of course, if you take this way of thinking about the accumulation of wealth, if you want, and you put it together with this strong emphasis on induction, on accumulating facts and trying to more or less automatically derive decisions from facts, you have this landscape that we're seeing now. Very, very strong trust in big data, a constant quest for ways of automating judgment so that less is on our shoulders as people who are taking these decisions and making these evaluations and inserting values into our systems, and more is just assigned to machines that can do all of that work for us. And I think in the words of Matteo Pasquinelli, who is this wonderful philosopher and historian who's written a really great book on the history of automation recently, it's called The Eye of the Master. I mean, this really is part of a very long history of mankind thinking about automating their own labor, their own mental labor, like trying to think about rationality in human beings and reasoning as something that eventually we can delegate. And that effort we're seeing really, exemplified by the way in which society is dealing with data at the moment. And of course, it has all sorts of implications. And I don't think it's surprising that people who are resisting that impulse among the philosophers, among the politicians, among the public intellectuals, among experts and people working in a variety of different fields, these are all people who also tend to want to own some of the decisions that they're taking and want to reflect on them and explicitly articulate some of the motivations and values behind those decisions is not surprising. And because as much as going into a fully automated decision-making world is attractive to everybody, I guess it would make our life easier in some ways. This sense that actually this really would lead to a complete loss of control, and not even just a loss of control, but a loss of any sense of what is right and wrong, why we think things are right and wrong, under which conditions are we evaluating, the knowledge that we have and we use and decisions that we're making. I mean, that is a really big worry, not just because of AI making this easier, right? But because of the social expectation that this kind of automation may be a social good, which I really don't believe is the case. I think we have enough evidence around the world of, how bad things are in so many respects, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's environmental, and the fact that many of the decisions being taken now are terrible. But of course, yeah, then you get the techno optimists that think, well, take all of these wonderful ideas about data facts, just go with them, and eventually we'll have the ideal society. And then you have people like me who are not particularly techno optimists. In fact, I'm pretty techno pessimist and think it's amazing to have technology such as generative AI and all the hardware that goes with this. But unless we use it responsibly, unless we really think carefully about how we're using it for which purposes, who is allowed to use it, who is involved in that use, and how this is in fact communicating and relating to non-humans and to life on the planet, then this is going to go very badly.
Yeah, yeah. It's a somber note, but certainly we need to. It needs to be said. Yeah. Vlasta, any comments on that?
I found this very intellectually rich and wrote quite some notes. So thank you for sharing it. Indeed, so I think yeah this induction point was strikes to me like a very strong one because induction is the way how humans are trying to understand nature and to integrate it and to get a hold of some uncertainty and that this mathematization induction might be leading to this type of things. The other aspect I found really interesting in what Sabina was saying, to me it sounds like some type of yeah modified pleasure machine argument. The pleasure machine argument says in ethics, like, would you like to just be in a
Mm.
pleasure machine and then you have like it's really nice for you, but you don't have the autonomy and it's not an authentic experience. And here it would be like this idea, okay, we are delegating all these hard choices, but we are also giving of decision making, but we are giving up our autonomy and we are giving our freedom and some sense of ownership. So it is interesting like how people actually feel about it. But and I also noticed this another point that I noticed is of course this obsession in the link so between capitalism, what Sabina was mentioning, and this idea of efficiency, because that is also one argument that's being given, right? So using AI is just very efficient. It's much faster. It saves us time. That's why we should use it, and then we can do more and more and more and acquire more and more and more. Um, but as we know from the history of technology, having this efficiency is not really reducing necessarily human work, but just putting higher expectations on what humans need to do daily. So now we can, yeah, automate a lot even in our work as teachers, but then maybe we will just have more courses to teach. So that could be, yes, a simple example. And then I have a question for Sabina. How does she see this, or whether there is a link between this, between the logical positivism, so the idea that we have this rigor, that we have the physics as paradigmatic science, and this method of science, the paradigmatic one, and all other sciences should look up to it. So uh, is that something that you think that plays a strong role, or just some intermediate role, or what do you think about
No,
it?
I think you're absolutely right that there's certainly role modeling that some disciplines, some practices are playing with respect to others. So, I mean, for me, it's been very interesting. That's why for many years I've been interested in actually comparing what is going on across different areas. We did it a little bit. We did what we did on data journeys, looking at this mostly in various areas of biology, biomedicine, but we also looked at physics, we also looked at astrophysics, environmental science, sociology, economics, design, looking at many of these areas. And of course, I've been lucky to work with many people who are experts in some of those areas. So having done that work, my feeling is that actually um, there are some stereotypes of how
Mhm.
certain disciplines work um, that are working very powerfully, both in the public imagination and the imagination of people who are not specialists in those disciplines. So the idea that molecular biology is fully grounded on genomic sequencing, and because of that we cannot do all these wonderful things, and it's all thanks to automated analysis of sequencing data. This is very, very powerful across many disciplines as an ideal for some of the things that one can achieve once one manages to automate and digitize a lot of the data and a lot of the empirical materials. Um, what I find typically is that once you look at what is going on within those disciplines that are being offered up as a stereotype, this is absolutely not the way things are working. So the last people that will be taking that kind of position around genomics and how easy it is to derive knowledge from genomic data would usually be the molecular biologists. I mean, because they are very direct and obvious experience of all the problems and all the ways in which you need to calibrate, decide, evaluate, constantly rethink your system to be able to extract even an ounce of significance out of that data. In fact, a lot of people within biology itself would worry about the exact opposite, would worry about the fact since many years, this has been a big discussion in biology, and whether this huge obsession with data production, and particularly digitalized data production, and particularly molecular data production, is in fact a really dangerous exercise because all the investments are going, the mass majority of investments are going towards these kind of, Fordian way of thinking about knowledge production, just pull out material in the hope that then, we'll find a magical way to analyze it. And in fact, much too little investment is going on techniques of analysis and interpretation, on actually investing in asking smart questions of this data and actually seeing to reaching an answer rather than just trusting an algorithm to very quickly give us fast and dirty results. So I think a lot of people within biology would be very skeptical about all of these claims around biology being the perfect example of what happens when you have a very advanced and sophisticated system of data production and data curation. But still, a lot of people in other fields regard that as the role model, right? And even more complex, if you look at the situation within biology, it's very clear that the emphasis on molecular sequence analysis is actually really damaged a lot of other parts of biology, which received almost no attention, very little investment, but in fact are indispensable for that very interpretation of genomic data. I mean, there's no point having a lot of molecular data if you don't really understand the development of a particular organism or the evolutionary trajectory, or you don't understand the ways in which molecular processes may relate to the level of cellular organization or even tissue organization, or the relationship between the organism and environmental stressors from the landscape and other organisms, right? So all of those things are really important to try and get answers in biology, but some of them have become really underestimated because of the emphasis on genomic data. So I would say it's a perverse almost mechanism whereby some fields seem to believe in almost the sanctity of certain methods that get stereotypized as working in other fields, whether it's astrophysics, whether it's molecular biology. And like psychology, I think is a good example of that, unfortunately, of having this ideal of having to be like randomized controlled trials, having to be like kind of, automated analysis from a collider in particle physics. And that would be when psychology finally is replicable and will produce good results. While in fact, a lot of the practices in psychology are very much like the problems that one encounters in molecular biology, but it doesn't seem to be recognized outside the field because that would make the story too complex. Obviously, the other thing that makes it even more complicated is the fact that we live in a world which is, of course, so competitive for researchers themselves in terms of acquiring funds, getting investment in what they do, getting attention to what they do, both politically, socially, and most importantly, financially. And that means that a lot of people feel forced to actually give in to these kind of stereotypical stories about how easy and it is to do their work and how important it is to invest in AI and data production, because that actually seems to be what works with funders who are more than happy to be told, oh, we give you some money now, and then we're going to have to spend less in the future because you're going to be able to automate things better, right? The argument seems to be a silver bullet for funding. Everybody keeps believing it. They all want to believe it because they want to spend less, and there's a financial crisis that keeps deepening around the world. And so, of course, that puts researchers in a situation where some of the things that they know very well, certainly in my experience, of the things that don't quite work, or are much more complex in their own world than many people would understand, they don't emphasize them either, because that may jeopardize their chances to get funding. And so, again, it's an even more perverse mechanism where all the incentives is on telling the story that this forms of automation and data-intensive, data-driven analysis work really well, where most of the people who actually are working in those fields know the complexity, but they still need to, feed themselves and their families and their laboratories and the work that they're doing. And so it becomes a very strange and contradictory set of incentives for many of these fields, I would say.
Yeah.
So it's some type of a fashion at the moment in science which has negative epistemic effect.
Oh,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, Rachel Anke and I have talked about these issues as questions of repertoire, right? Of very particular forms of doing research, which have all sorts of components, methodological, social, ideological. They relate to certain sets of values and certain funding imperatives and military imperatives. They become dominant in science and actually very, very difficult to shake them. I would say the idea in biology that we can have a data-driven understanding grounded on molecular data is an incredibly successful repertoire. I mean, it's basically impossible to kill. I mean, we've been trying for 20, 30 years. It's been productive in some ways to work in this way. Now, many people would agree, it's time to give it a rest and have a much more integrated, holistic way of thinking about different types of data sets within biology and how to integrate them. And yet, till now, the vast majority of investment goes into bigger and bigger and bigger sequencing projects. Sequencing the whole of biodiversity on Earth, sequencing the whole of biodiversity in this particular nation, barcoding everything. I mean, it's still where the attention goes. It still is the kind of thing that will get very considerable funding. And there is a sense in which if you're the head of a lab or an institute and you're struggling to survive and you want your own legacy to continue, there will be a very, very strong incentive to go for that kind of rhetorics because it keeps working.